Hello and welcome back to Pirated Radio. In this episode, I speak to a gentleman called Paul Nicholson, who is probably best known for designing the Aphex Twin logo, but has done numerous other things in many different avenues, from clothing to brand identity and everything in between, pretty much. And we discuss his early influences, his time in education, sort of the approach he has to work, designing for aliens, and all manner of things, really. But yeah, I hope you enjoy. So, as I do with every guest on this, to begin with, could you give the people that are maybe listening and aren't familiar with your work a bit of a brief rundown as to who you are and what you do?
Well, my name's Paul Nicholson. I studied at Kingston University from 89 to 92. So I've been putting work out since late 91. So whilst I was in my third year, I did manage to do graphic design, which is the whole point of going to university. So to be able to do that while still at uni kind of served its purpose. But the first logos I did late 91 were for electronic music club called Knowledge, and for Aphex Twin. So I had a pretty good introduction to the world of design, and it pretty much set a precedent for the rest of my career. So for a lot of my output has been music related. So worked with quite a few artists and record labels over the years. When I left university, through my work at Knowledge, I met a guy who was running a garment printing company and was also a designer himself. So initially we were going to set up a clothing brand together. But as we worked more and more together, it just made sense to go into business. So he managed and ran the print side, and I focused more on the design side of the company. But obviously, with any partnership, there was lots of crossover. So he would have a lot of input on the design work, and likewise, I would be involved in the print side of the business. So I've had a lot of work with fashion labels and music companies and computer games companies, taking their IP and creating garment designs and merchandise designs for people. So, it's quite cool, especially during the 90s with the boom in the computer games industry. We did a lot of work with people like Sony Entertainment and Psygnosis and people like that. So we got to work on games like Full Metal Jacket, not Full Metal Jacket, what's it called? Anyway, yeah, 90s games. I'm getting confused because it's a film, isn't it?
Full Metal Jacket.
Metal Gear Solid.
Oh,
Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah. Big.
So, over the years, we went to a few really good Sony launch parties for computer games. So I guess the 90s were to computer games what the 70s were to rock. It was all about excess and very over-the-top parties, huge budgets, and lots of drunkenness and debauchery. So, yeah, the Sony parties were always a highlight.
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame with the games industry. I think it's kind of not a lot of games even get produced at this time of year. They had the Game Awards the other night, and it was just kind of like, we were talking about it at work the other day, and people were mentioning that they come out and they'd be like, there's a load of different games and it's been a really good year for games. But it's like, I can't even think of many games that have come out this year that I'm kind of like, what's even come out to begin with?
We were not so much stung, but we were certainly hit quite badly on two occasions where Sony had released hardware, but in the run up to Christmas weren't able to produce enough units. So what happened is that there was a big hype for, I think we're talking about the PS2 and the handheld one, the PSP. So, Sony were getting all excited and telling us to get ready for this, tsunami of work. And then what happened was they'd released the consoles, but there just weren't enough units. And because a lot of the games developers were relying on that Christmas boom time. Obviously, a lot of their £2 and £3 million investments that had gone into a game kind of fell short. So if you've only got 50,000 PS2s delivered in Europe for Christmas, of that 50,000, if you've got 10 or 20 games out at a time, you can see that a lot of the games companies were really badly hit up. So Codemasters and Psygnosis and all of EA games. So it was bad for us because we'd built up a lot of work and a good relationship with computer games industries, and then that kind of boom time, the kind of golden point in time, just didn't evolve, didn't happen. So it was a real kick in the balls.
Are you a gamer yourself? Do you play many computer games?
Ironically enough, never. When I was a kid, Mum and Dad got me and my brother an Atari 1040. So this is pointing at a time and a place on it. Probably 1982. My brother loved it. He is an electronic musician, so I think he loves that whole thing of programming. But I think about 10 minutes putting in code onto a cassette tape, and that was it. So even in my 20s, and I'd go back home and hook up with my mates from when I was at school, and they'd be playing, Sega Mega Drive and PlayStation games, and I just was never interested. But I've always found the aesthetic and the gaming culture something I'm really interested in. So if there's any books on game design, on gaming culture, or exhibitions, like there was a really great one that took my son to at the V&A, and they had 600 consoles he could play on, going right back to the early 70s. So it was great being able to take my son there and have him see the sort of basic games that I remember as a kid. But yeah, I mean, I can remember, let me think, it'd be about 83, 84. A friend of mine, Martin, he had the Atari 2600 and playing Tank Battle and Ping Pong and all those really, really early Atari games. But yeah, never really got into it at all. But then that said as well, I never got into board games. So Monopoly, Yahtzee, anything like that. If Mum and Dad were like, come on, let's all play games, I'd be like, oh, no, thank you. Just wasn't my bag.
You mentioned sort of your early years. Do you have any early memories of what sort of originally got you into sort of graphic design and sort of the art world at all?
I think just generally being into drawing. I always enjoyed just drawing. And I think as well as it was the use of the imagination. I like creating these imaginary worlds and what have you. There were a lot of sci-fi artists during the 60s and 70s, and there was books that were put out, people like Chris Voss and Jim Burns. So I really got into sci-fi art. So I remember at my secondary school in the library, they had a book, I think it was called Space Rex. And it was all those kind of airbrush paintings from the 70s of huge star destroyers crashed onto alien worlds. So I think sci-fi art was always something that I was really into. But running alongside that as well is, as a kid, pre-internet and pre-even television. I mean, I was 14 when Channel 4 came out. So there wasn't that much on television at all for children. So I got into things like Lego and plastic models. So from quite an early age, I was doing, scale models, dioramas, all those modeling type things. But yeah, won a few competitions. So I think I was always into being creative, but things like customizing toys. So I'd have a 1/24th scale car, and I would paint it up to look like the General Lee from the Dukes of Hazzard, even though it was completely the wrong car. But, putting the Confederate flag and the 01 on the doors.
You mentioned your time at Kingston University when we first started talking. Do you have any fond memories of that time that have maybe molded you into who you are today as a designer?
I think when I was at university, I caught the tail end of a much easier time for students. I got a student grant, so I got £3,000 a year from the government to go to university. Tuition was free, and this was at a time when I was paying £50 a week rent. So my grant check meant that I had no worries about paying the rent. So I could afford to live in London uh, for the full year, not have to go home over the summer holidays and things like that. Also, as well as it was a different time in for employment where it was very easy to get part-time work, and you had the Sunday market. What would they call it? It's the Sunday trading law. So shops couldn't open on a Sunday. So I'd got a job at Sainsbury's stacking shelves on the Sunday where you were paid triple pay because it was classed as antisocial hours. So even with the grant, I was getting part-time work and, you know, pay my way through uni. So as opposed to having a debt, I left uni with, I think, about 3 or 4 grand in the bank, which in 1992 was, you know, a decent amount of money, given that rent was 50 quid a week. So, you know, I had in my bank account enough to cover 2 years' rent in theory. But my apart from the kind of practicalities, I think the reason why it made it good is that there wasn't any pressure. There wasn't the financial pressure of this kind of looming debt that I'd have after 3 years. So it just made for a much more enjoyable time. And I think as well is because there was no pressure, I think that my approach at university was probably by current standards a little bit slapdash and laissez-faire because, you know, I very rarely did any of the projects. Or if I did start on them, I'd go off on such tangents that they very rarely had little to do with what the project set out to do. And a lot of the time I would drift into, you know, lectures within the fine art department of fashion or architecture, just to learn something new or to learn something from a different angle. So I was a little bit of, you know, butterfly really in that respect. I was all over the shop. And, you know, it was just good fun. I mean, I had a really good time. I came to London pretty much with the capital in my focus from about the age 13, 14. I knew I wanted to move to London. So even when I was looking for universities, I didn't even bother looking at Manchester or Sheffield or Hull or whatever. It was definitely London that I was going to go to. And I'd had this love of electronic music from about the age of 12. So coming down to London just after my 19th birthday, you know, I caught the tail end of acid house, and then caught the start of what was at the time techno. I mean, techno, its meaning now has changed. I mean, techno was a very broad term for anything electronic and kind of experimental. So Knowledge, the club that I did the logo for, on any given night, they might be playing anything from ambient music by Rising High all the way through to GABA music from PCP Records. And in amongst that all would be Warp artists, Richie Hawtin from Plus 8, Laurie D from Italy. It was a real cornucopia of anything electronic. So it was a really small club, about 400 people, and it says a lot about the size of the techno scene at the time, that all of those genres of music, that there were possibly 500 or 600 people in the whole of London that were kind of tuned into it. So it was a really great time for myself coming to London. because everything that I'd been slowly getting more and more into, it all kind of exploded. I think 88, 89. So the timing was just spot on, right place, right time.
Can you remember the first piece of electronic music you listened to?
Very much so. It would be Vangelis, Albedo 0.39, which, most people know Vangelis for the Blade Runner soundtrack and Chariots of Fire, which is probably 8 or 9 years after Albedo 0.39. And Albedo 0.39, I've said that in about 2 minutes, 3 times, but the LP was very experimental and kind of space age. And, I used to have to share a room with my brother. So we had one of those crappy Amstrad sound systems in my bedroom. It was like a hand-me-down from mum and dad. But I had like a set of headphones, and I would just be playing stuff like that. And it was really through Vangelis that I got into electronic music really quickly. And this was at a time where you go into a record shop and there'd just be like a small section. And if I remember rightly, in Harrogate, it was called Electronic and Avant-Garde. So everything was in there. So Kraftwerk, Yellow, quite a mixed bag. And whenever I'd get my paper round money, it'd be like, well, how am I going to blow this week's paper round money? And just finding a new LP. And most of the time, it was just, again, pre-internet, you'd have to do your own research. So you started to pick up on certain record labels, certain producers. So, for example, Editions EG, they put out, it was like a cheap compilation album to promote artists on the label. And that's how I found out about people like Brian Eno and his brother Roger Eno, Penguin Cafe Orchestra. So it kind of spun out from there. And then, other music would come along like industrial or Belgian new beat. So you were constantly on the lookout for stuff that was electronic. But then you'd also get the crossover where you'd have stuff that was maybe a little bit more at the rock end of industrial. So people like Wise Blood. So again, I think I'd be 16 when I got that LP. And then some, Scraping Fetus Off the Wheel, the Butthole Surfers. So you would just start to find these bands. And then, of course, anyone of my generation will always say John Peel. And John Peel was like music god, because in a life ruled by just kind of mainstream mediocrity, you just had this shining light late night on Radio 1. And, most of the time, because he's playing indie music and rock music and all kinds of different genres, it's safe to say that on any given hour, there might only be one track you like, but it'd be that track that would introduce you to a new band or a new artist. So, yeah, indispensable, really.
You have kind of touched on this in bits and pieces, but your work has obviously got a very particular style to it. And I was just curious, what are sort of your bigger influences in sort of the visual landscape? And is it sort of a style that you developed, to sort of began developing during your time in education?
It's something where I wouldn't say I follow one particular look or a certain style as such. I think generally speaking, I'm quite interested in a lot of things. So if I'm visiting a new city, I'm very much keen to take as many photographs as possible of architecture. So I'm really interested in architecture, and I'm sure that comes into my work. As I mentioned before, like with those sci-fi art books, I think science fiction as stuff that I read and films that I watch plays a big part, I'm sure, because I do like that whole idea of either alien worlds otherworldliness or the whole imagination that comes with science fiction. The fact it's set in the future is usually a convenient point in time, because then you can break with any kind of social norms and rules that we presently live with. So the future in a lot of cases really is just a convenient point in time. So I think that the whole kind of science, technology, futurism, modernism, brutalism, these are all things that I'm very much into. And I'm sure a mix of those things results in the work that I do. As a general rule, I know people talk about stuff that I've done as having a certain boldness or timelessness about them. So yeah, generally the work that I do tends to have a stronger imprint. So I doubt you'll see me getting a contract to do ladies' perfume bottles. So yeah, it tends to be reflects a lot of the things I'm into, but I tend to be into things that are very bold, brash, bright colours. And especially like with architecture, I'm very much into concrete and brutalism and the more grandeur of kind of those architectural projects.
When you talk about your work being timeless, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because if your influences are sort of otherworldly, they're not really, they're obviously timeless because they're not referencing a sort of time on Earth, are they? They're kind of referencing something that's kind of, do you get what I'm trying to say? There's no link back to it. It's kind of interesting.
Well, definitely. I know that a lot of the time at the back of my head, it's like you've almost got this like little post-it note in the back of your head, make it look not of this earth. So when I'm working on things, definitely the thought that this is some kind of sigil or symbol that has been found on the side of a crashed alien craft is an inspiration. So I know when I did the Aphex Twin logo, at that time I was also working with an American skatewear brand called Anarchic Adjustment, and their thing at the time was all UFOs and aliens. So you see that a lot in early 90s artwork, the kind of grey-faced aliens with black almond eyes, it crops up a lot. So that was very much an arcade shtick. So around about that time, I met Richard and he asked what I did and we got chatting. And I showed him sketchbooks. So he got to see a lot of the work I was doing for Anarchic Adjustment. And really, for Richard, it was just kind of taking that sense of creating something otherworldly to its kind of ultimate conclusion. So, a lot of the time, that's what people do pick up on, is that kind of not being able to quite play something. And that. I mean, again, when you talk about inspiration, I take a lot of interest in just general and popular culture. So I will read books about current trends in fashion, architecture, car design, aviation. I mean, I think that it's like I was saying before, the sum of all of these interests mean that you'll find something in amongst it all. How can I put it? It's a bit like, I know like with the humans, we're very good at pattern recognition. So I kind of like the idea that I'm inputting all of this raw data and the brain will just kind of find some logic that's unique to the sum of all of this information that's gone in there.
Yeah, like almost producing a piece of electronic music where it is sort of coded. You're almost spitting it out as if it's a code. Yeah. I was going to say, it would be interesting to see if we do ever come in contact with aliens, if you've got it right. If they land and they've got the Aphex Twin logo on the side of a spaceship. It's sort of like, I knew that.
I think the chance of us meeting an alien that we can even comprehend it is pretty slim. I think the idea of them being bags of flesh is very slim. I would have thought that any species that has worked out ways of traveling time and space probably don't exist in our realm, or certainly not in a way that we can be aware of. So it'll be some form of, it has to be some form of pure energy. So when people go on about, oh, look, I've seen a spacecraft, I mean, it's just, I don't know. I don't know enough, but if there's wormholes where you can just drop into one point in time and space and appear elsewhere, maybe you would transport a physical being. But I think more and more, a lot of the people are looking at quantum physics and space travel. A lot of the current thinking seems to be that it won't be a physical being that is transported across the universe.
I was gonna ask, just as a side note, and might have been gone down a tangent. I was just gonna say, do you believe in aliens? But you've kind of answered that, haven't you, in a way?
I think I do enjoy Brian Cox, because I do love the way that he reduces things down into very easily understood ways. But it's just when you think of the sheer scale of the universe, there has been other life. But you take our current epoch, I mean, human beings in its modern format is at a push 100,000 years old. But the universe is, well, current thinking is, I think, 13.8 billion, but there's even talk now that the universe may be twice as old. So let's go for a conservative 25 billion years. How many times have civilizations like ours risen and gone into self-destruction? I mean, I think there's a very good chance we will destroy ourselves before we have technology even to reach the edge of the solar system, let alone cross a galaxy. And you kind of think, well, the kind of folly and stupidity of humanity, I mean, that could have been replicated billions of times throughout the universe, where, you know, life has developed intelligence and then developed weapons and then blown itself up. So, yeah, and like our own species, I mean, we don't really dedicate that much of our time and money to traveling the cosmos. So why should any other intelligence? It seems a bit
very
naive to think that a being is going to expend huge amounts of energy just to watch a bunch of ape descendants throwing rockets at each other.
Yeah. There was a theory that I read.
We'd make a pretty disappointing scientific experiment.
Well, there's two theories I've read years ago. One was that we're sort of a zoo, and they're just staying far enough back and then looking at us. And the other one was that we're just sort of, when you walk past a worm in the street, you don't think twice about it. So it is just that we're too below them to even for them to even come and look at us or anything.
Well, I mean, if you think about evolution generally, I mean, evolution is about destruction. One species will dominate as another disappears. And you look at the universe, a star will grow and grow and grow, become a sun and become black holes or red dwarfs, or even just simply blow up. I think the very nature of the way that universe works is that things will either self-destruct or be destroyed by something bigger and stronger. So it's not surprising that humanity will probably obliterate itself, because, yeah, there's a positive, upbeat note for all the listeners.
Jumping back to Earth, and you did mention previously that you are interested in clothing. You've always had your own clothing brands and labels and things. Are there any sort of clothing labels that you take interest in particular, or anything of that nature?
think broadly speaking, I'd say that military clothing, streetwear, workwear, yeah, you could say functional clothing is pretty much where I draw most of my wardrobe from. So, I mean, Carhartt, um, let me think, G-Star, CP Company, Maharishi, Acronym. I mean, all of those brands you can see will either have some inspiration from military or workwear, or yeah. And then you know, as a kid, I was into BMX and skateboarding, and even now I cycle. So a lot of clothing that is functional. So I'm just about to go snowboarding, so I've got myself some like merino wool base layers and you know, waterproof gloves and ski socks. So it's that thing where the sort of clothing I like is usually clothing that serves a function or a purpose. And I mean, I tend to wear cargo trousers a lot, and for a lot of people, those pockets are just decoration. But I will have stuff stuffed into my pockets and very rarely carry bags. So I will use clothing as its intended purpose, something to carry stuff.
Do you keep kind of a sketchbook on you as you're going around and just jot things down, just out of curiosity?
Not as much as I used to. I think when you're younger and everything is new and you're very obsessed with documenting everything, I think it's very much part of the process of a creative is in those formative years is that you're kind of discovering yourself, for want of a better term. But I think now, I'm constantly recording and memorizing things, and it's always there. But I think sketching for me is more of a functional thing. So when I've got a project, I do like to start in a sketchbook and just jotting ideas down. I find that process of mind to hand to pencil to paper is the most free flowing and intuitive. I think once you, if you try starting a project in Illustrator, which is a vector based computer program, you can't help but pull down rulers and measure things up and balance everything out. So it's not a good place to start creatively because your ideas are being inhibited by the very kind of rigid structural aspect of a vector-based program. So yeah, start pen and paper, and then a lot of the time, even once I will scan an image, I'll drop into Photoshop, and I've got like a Wacom tablet. So even then, when I'm actually working out the vectors, I'm still using a pencil, as it were, with the what do they call them? Not pencils. Yeah, the Wacom pen, whatever they call them. But I find that you just get curves and balance that you wouldn't necessarily do if you were using rigid geometry. So it's just a bit more, more free flowing.
This is sort of the midpoint bit of the show where I ask all the guests the same question. And it's sort of the idea that if you could pick one thing throughout your career which has been really the heartbeat and been sort of the main inspiration for yourself, be it anything you want, it can be a song, movie, book, person, whatever you can think that would be, what would that be for yourself?
Kind of goes back to what I said before, in so much that I'm not really looking for any one thing. I would say that the one thing that is a source of inspiration is I don't know if this sounds a bit wanky, but it's like it's the way that my brain works. So it's something that I try to feed. So by just allowing things to happen, most of the time when I start a project, I don't really know what I'm going to do. So I quite like to maintain a certain level of flexibility and, in a way, naivety. By not having a process, by not having an ideal that I'm aspiring to, things can just happen. So, yeah, probably, if anything, I probably try to engender a certain amount of chaos and a certain amount of, naivety. Sometimes when you're working with people, you kind of think, oh my God, I hope they don't suss me out. I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. But yeah, it's yeah, probably the opposite of having structure.
Yeah, jumping forward. I was reading your AMA on Reddit when I wrote these questions originally, and you mentioned that you try and almost, when you go into projects, you do the opposite of what the industry is doing. So I just wanted to know, what were your thoughts on sort of the larger design industry as a whole?
I take a lot of interest, and when I become aware of certain trends, my inclination is like, well, I won't go there. So as part of the design process, it's good to be aware of what's going on, because these are all things that I'll simply not do. If that makes sense, it's I mean, put really simple, if everybody's doing everything with squares, I'll do it with circles. And I mean, you take the era when I did the Aphex Twin logo. There was a lot of work that I was doing at the time that was very curved, corners, everything rounded off. And it was at a time when a lot of work was very linear, very kind of sharp edges and rectangles and things like that. But yeah, as far as the industry goes, yeah, you're aware of certain trends, so I'll just try and avoid that. Also as well is there are certain things you cannot avoid. When people come to you and want work, they've seen stuff you've done, and that has inspired them, and they want a little piece of that with what they're doing. So if somebody comes to me and says, "Oh, I really love the Solutions logo. I love the way that you've created this kind of quite organic shape, what have you," you can't suddenly then just go off on a wild tangent, because they'll just go, "Well, I'm not paying you." That's a bag of knackers. So it is that thing. When I get projects like that, I see it as being able to refine and develop on work that I've done in the past. I try as much as possible not to replicate, but then obviously when you work in a certain way, people will see your fingerprint, as it were. So just like when a musician releases a new EP, you go, yeah, I know who that is. So there's certain things that you can't strip away completely, and you can't create something completely new each time, because a lot of the time people coming to you are wanting your touch. So there has to be something within what you create that has that essence that people are basically paying you for. So every now and again, I mean, in the case of Solutions, which are St. Petersburg-based fashion kind of art collective, I was pretty much given free rein. So over time, as I submitted ideas, and Gleb, who is Solutions, he would pick certain things out, and it was very much something that evolved between the two of us. And every now and again, it's quite good that you'll add to your portfolio something that is in a new direction, because then that spawns another series of projects where people are drawn to that particular look. So, I mean, obviously not so much now, but there was a time where people go, "Oh, I really like Aphex Twin logo." So you would have people wanting to work with you because they've seen that. And more recently, because I've worked in quite different markets as well, it's quite good. It's not just musicians. So I worked with two really big archive sites on Instagram. So there's a whole different kind of type of person coming to me having seen that work. So I mean, the way I look at it is every now and again is to throw in a curveball, add into what I do something that is as much as possible a new direction, because I see that as spawning a new generation of work. And also as well is because, as I say, you're able to refine and develop a particular way of working. By putting something new into the mix, it gives me a whole kind of new project over a couple of years.
Hello. So this one's a bit of a weird one. What has happened is the audio recording for this podcast at the end kind of broke, and I've lost sort of the final, I want to say about 20-30% of it. So all of the last questions after this, I just sort of lost in the internet, I think. So what I've done is I've spoken to Paul over sort of the New Year and Christmas, and we're going to do another call at some point just to go through the last ones again. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try and write some new questions so I don't ask him the same questions. So basically this is part one. We're going to do another one at some point, have another discussion, and that'll be part two. When that'll be, I don't know. But Paul has said he's fine with it and we'll do it at some point. So I'll have to just kind of organise the questions and things. But yeah, bit of a bummer, but I think it's just lost forever. I've been trying to decipher it back together and things, and I just can't find the audio, so bloody internet. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for listening to this part. Hopefully you come back and listen to part two. If you don't, that's understandable. Yeah, cheers for listening, I guess. See you next time.